Good afternoon, everyone. Thank you so much for coming today. This is the Farnsworth Art Museum. This is our lunch talk online at 1 p.m. and we're very happy to have you with us today. I am joined by Dr. William Coleman and Amy Morey, both of the Wyeth Study Center, and we're here today to talk with you about our lovely exhibition here at the Farnsworth, Every Leaf Twig, Andrew Wyeth's Botanical Imagination, and we're just getting it all queued up for you now. This exhibition, which just opened at the Farnsworth, presents a lot of works that have actually never been seen by the public before. So it's really a truly exciting exhibition. And I have to say, one that I've really personally even enjoyed. The exhibition itself will be on view until March 24th of 2024. So you've got a couple months to see it, at least into 2024, and a great time in January and February and March when it's cold outside and you need something to inspire you, please come over to the Farnsworth. I know that we've had a dedicated amount of school groups, special tours just to see this exhibition, and a wonderful number of visitors to see this as well. And it's inspired a lot of the work that we do here today. Just to give you a bit of background before we begin, Amy Morey conceived of this project, and it took the team at the Wyeth Study Center under the direction of William L. Coleman to put this all together. And this was all put together also with our curatorial colleagues here at the Farnsworth, led by Jamie DeSimone, and our great colleagues at Brandywine and the Wyeth Study Center. And then will give you a little bit more details, also the fact that this exhibition will travel to the Wyeth Study Center, to Brandywine, February 24th of 2024 is when it will open. So I also want to let you know that we have a catalog that is hot off the press. You can actually buy it in our shop, and that has recently been published, and it's a beautiful catalog. And we will certainly enjoy talking about it today. And actually, I'm going to pass this over to Will very quickly, but I'm also going to just introduce our speakers today. We'll hear from Amy Morey, who is the Associate Collection Manager for the Andrew and Betsy Wyeth Study Center and lead curator of the exhibition Every Leaf Twig, Andrew Wyeth's Botanical Imagination. She has worked closely with Betsy James Wyeth for more than 21 years. William L. Coleman, PhD, is Wyeth Foundation Curator and Director of the Andrew and Betsy Wyeth Study Center, dividing time between the two locations of the study center, one at the Farnsworth and one at the Brandywine Museum of Art in Pennsylvania. So I am going to turn it over to you, Will. I'm going to put myself on silent here and let you take it away.
Hello, everyone. Thanks very much, Gwendolyn, for that kind introduction. Thanks for spending your lunch break with us today to get into a dialogue about this exciting exhibition, which is the latest fruit of our really unique consortial partnership around the creative legacy of Andrew and Betsy Wyeth across two poles of that world, Chaddsford, Pennsylvania, and Rockland, Maine. It's been such a privilege getting to know the great folks up at the Farnsworth. I hope to meet more of you as I go back and forth between Pennsylvania and Maine in this unique role. And it's been a particular privilege to get to learn from my colleague, Amy Morey, whom, as you've heard, has been deep in this story for much longer than yours truly. I'm about a year into this exciting new era for Wyeth Studies. And Amy, Leith McDonald, and Karen Baumgartner, the staff of the Andrew and Betsy Wyeth Study Center across 2 states, have already taught me a great deal. So you'll be seeing more exhibitions like this one. Another exciting one coming right after on Wyeth and abstraction that we're already enjoying down in Pennsylvania. And we'll swap places with these two projects with 2 beautiful books to connect them and tell the story. Can we have the next slide, please? And we'll share with you the cover of that book. There you go. So this is quite literally hot off the presses. I understand that Janice up there in Rockland has just received her store inventory of this beautiful book with essays from me, Amy, and our outside collaborator, coastal botanist Lauren Stockwell, about whom you'll be hearing more later, designed by Jenny Chan of Jack Design, coordinated by Todd Bradway, with the whole team across these 2 partnered institutions, bringing these things to life and making sure that we capture the insights of these projects as we dive deep into the possibilities of what we call the Andrew and Betsy Wyeth collection. And these are amazing objects, most of which have never been exhibited publicly before, that really pack a punch and have a lot of stories yet to tell. The refrain that we keep on hearing is, "I thought I knew Andrew Wyeth, but I had no idea." And I hope that you'll come away from this deep dive into Wyeth's response to botanical subjects, his evocative, visionary, imaginative portraits of plants, saying just that. So without further ado, Amy, could you turn on your camera and introduce yourself to everybody? I want you to see the colleague who brought this idea forward, who came with this recognition from deep knowledge of the collection, that there's a really interesting story yet to be told here. Are you able to show your camera? I'm not seeing your face yet there, Amy, but I hope we will soon. So far, you're seeing an installation shot of the exhibition, and you'll get a sense of the layout there across the Hadlock and Wyeth Study Center galleries of the Farnsworth Art Museum. So hopefully we can hear your voice, even if we can't see you just now, Amy. Can you say hello?
I can say hello. Good afternoon.
There we go. Okay, good. Now I see you. I was seeing Gwendolyn's thumbnail, I think. So that's a relief. Welcome. Anything you want to say by way of introduction and setup?
No, I would just want to say that this is an exciting exhibition to plan and work on, and great thanks to you for your support and guidance. But it was interesting. The whole idea for Every Leaf and Twig sort of came about in a back doorway. I've been working on the inventory and was absolutely intrigued with the number of nature watercolors and drawings in the collection. And going back and looking at them carefully, I thought, this is a interesting idea. Maybe a show or an exhibition could come out of this project. And sort of coincidentally, at the same time, I discovered two incredibly rich letters that Andrew had written to the family members, illustrated and about nature. And the two ideas were so exciting that it wasn't long before we had plans for the exhibition on the drawing board.
I love that this exhibition is rooted in the archive, rooted in the documentary evidence that is central to what we do in the Wyeth Study Center across these two states. This collection of some 7,000 artworks that are the flagship, the most visible part of our work. But these documents, these letters are really fascinating, and viewers can see the beautiful case that Robert there at the Farnsworth built for this project on the left side of your screen. And there's the second. There we go. Perfect. So two of these beautiful illustrated letters. They refuse to sit neatly in any of our categories. They're not just text on a page. They're not purely watercolor paintings. There's some hybrid of the two. But what really fascinates all of us about these is how they show this, what we call botanical imagination, the way he is diving into unpeopled natural subjects, pure plant matter, and finding all the imaginative potential a creative life requires within these plants. So we'll tell you a little more about those archival inspirations as we go through, but I appreciate you raising that as part of it. So we're starting to define our terms here. We start with that broad concept of images of nature. Of course, many of us think of Wyeth as a landscape painter. We're not just talking about landscape. We're talking about something very specific here, which is when an individual plant specimen, or indeed a community of plants, fills the frame, fills the page, and really interesting things happen. So could you tell us a little bit about the title of the exhibition? What does that mean?
Well, the title Every Leaf and Twig came from Henry David Thoreau's Walden, and it refers to nature. Thoreau was deeply immersed in nature, as was Andrew Wyeth. And the book on the left side of the case that we're looking at now is actually a first edition copy of Walden that is from N.C. Wyeth's catalog. And
let's clarify who N.C. Wyeth is. Hopefully we've got all kinds of Wyeth fans on, but yeah, let's explain our name there. Who is N.C.?
N.C. Wyeth was Andrew's father, and N.C. himself was a great admirer of Henry David Thoreau. In fact, he promoted actively looking at nature with his whole family. encouraging them to look at the beauty of all the world around them. And as a result, spent a lot of time walking the properties in both Maine and Chatsford with his family, looking for the first spring beauties or anything that would evoke some thoughts of the beautifulness and the creativeness that they were looking at.
Mm-hmm. We're getting some core ideas there that maybe we have a concept of naturalism rather than science or scientific method. This kind of immersion in the natural world and a meditative or even mindful reflection on its rhythms, its processes, its cycles of death and rebirth, but not so much natural science. Just as Thoreau is not really a natural scientist, so are we saying Wyeth is not really a natural scientist. And so we want to be really careful about articulating that up front. Can we go back to that previous slide, the case there? Yeah, so we see the Thoreau book on the left. You're getting a sense that Andrew Wyeth, the son of this influential artist, illustrator, Father NC, is growing up in this kind of transcendental worldview, the steeping oneself in the evocative potential of nature, that mystical, magical vision of nature rather than merely scientific method. He's evoking that in letters, like the center of the case, and not least, he's taking up his paint box that you see there and going out into that world to record what he sees and to be inspired to depart from what he sees too. So there's a lot there. Amy, can you help us understand one other kind of elephant in the room here right up front? We're talking about Wyeth as maybe a naturalist, not a scientist. Would it be correct to call Andrew and Betsy Wyeth environmentalists?
Probably not in the terms of what we think environmentalists are today, but they both were certainly attuned to nature and were very well aware of the rhythms of nature, the life cycle of nature.
I think that's a key point. So we want to be really clear about what we're communicating here up front. We're recognizing an artist who is uncannily attuned to the natural world and recognizing some fragility within it, but we're not claiming that he's an environmentalist as we currently conceive of it. And there's a whole story yet to be told that we're working on telling of his partnership with Betsy Wyeth in transforming the world around them and shaping and designing it. So it's complicated, it's fascinating, but we do have a really rich story of art engaged with nature here. And taking us forward, is this a story that exists in isolation, or are there other contemporaries of Wyeth who are similarly zooming in, not zooming out, honing in on the individual plant specimen?
Other artists were expressing nature in a very similar manner. Excuse me. At the Farnsworth, there are two works one by George O'Keeffe entitled, excuse me, number 38, Special Canna Leaves, which was done in 1920-21 period, and a little later an Andy Warhol piece called Flowers, 1966, which were definitely in the sort of the manner of Andrew's working in a visionary way of presenting nature. Absolutely.
I think that's really powerful. There is often this trap that we get into with this artist who is so well loved. It's a really nice problem to have that Andrew Wyeth has this massive general public appeal nationally and internationally. There's a risk that we treat that story in isolation, that we cut him off from his contemporaries, that we think of Wyeth as this essential creative force as an outsider artist, something who had no connection to contemporary art. And that's simply not true. And that's what we're finding as we dig into the archive. We find that he is aware of these contemporary cross currents, other artists who are similarly finding possibility in these humble subjects of the natural world. Just as in our other concurrent project, we're finding Wyeth was deeply aware of abstract expressionism, not the country bumpkin cut off from the big city art world that we've sometimes been spoon-fed, but quite the contrary. A sophisticated inhabitant of a contemporary art world who is taking up these other practices when they serve his goals and going his own way in realism when that is what inspiration dictates. So let's get into what we learned from talking with natural scientists about this project. What did we learn from Lauren Stockwell?
This is a photograph, as noted on the screen, of Allen Island. And Lauren Stockwell and two of her botanist, a contemporary, spent quite a bit of time each summer for about 5 years inventorying the mosses and plants and trees on Allen. So she had a great sense of the environment along the mid-coast, and in her professional career, she worked along the Maine coast. So thinking about and looking at the watercolors and drawings we were considering for the exhibition, I immediately remembered Lauren and our association and contacted her and asked her to come look at these wonderful watercolors and help me identify the plants and trees. And she, within a day or two, was here at the Farnsworth, and we looked at the artwork, and she said, I've really got to think about this. And she thought for a while, and finally we got back to a discussion, and she said, you know, it's really hard for me to look at a lot of these images because I don't see the detail. Andrew Wyeth is an extremely realistic painter, and he's painted the Maine coast as I know it and as we all know it. But she said, in terms of really being able to identify the different ferns and mosses that we were looking at, she said it's very difficult. Again, he was a transformative, working in a transformative method, not a scientific method. So I started looking at the works with that idea in mind.
Some really key ideas there that I want to underline. We are understanding Andrew Wyeth as a practitioner of a fundamentally transformative, not merely replicative method. And Lauren Stockwell's observations confirm that. When somebody finds realism useful to their creative process, we run the risk of thinking of them as a mere photographer, clicking a shutter, documenting observed realities. And as we dig deeper and deeper into this fascinating essential story in our shared cultural heritage, we find ever more evidence that Wyeth is a visionary. Wyeth is transforming what he sees, and we learned that in new ways from Lauren Stockwell. We should clarify what Allen Island is. Can you tell us a little more about what is this context and why it matters to the Wyeths?
Allen Island is a large 350, 400 acre island off the coast of Port Clyde, which was part of the Wyeth family property, and most recently has been purchased by Colby College. But it's also the site of many of the watercolors and drawings that are exhibited in this exhibition.
Perfect. So we're getting a key context there. We're getting a designed environment with a deep natural and human history. And you're getting a sense of the buildings there, the way Betsy James Wyeth in particular was transforming that landscape that Andrew Wyeth depicted. What else did we learn from Lauren Stockwell in conjunction with her botanical research on the islands about how Andrew Wyeth was depicting the island?
Well, it was interesting. Some of her photography from years ago when she was doing her inventory project show the effects of the environment and weather on some of the plants. In this case, we can see a flag tree. And in this case, we're looking at one of Andrew's watercolor paintings in the exhibition, Scrub Spruce. And you can almost feel the wind, the salt water, and the elements as it collides with the tree almost in a storm. And we have this sort of stunted version of what we think of as a spruce tree.
Maybe here is a good chance to underline one of the further inspirations of this show that came out in talking with Lauren Stockwell, as well as in the shared context of the Pennsylvania half of this partnered exhibition, that we're seeing significant changes in the ecosystems that Andrew Wyeth depicted since his lifetime. Lauren is helping us to understand as we see Wyeth documenting, depicting these battered trees growing in this harsh growing environment, that with the rapid warming of the Gulf of Maine, there's every likelihood we're going to see forest succession and a change in the species of these places. Similarly, in Pennsylvania, we're seeing unprecedented weather events that are impacting his beloved landscape of Chadds Ford. So that's a deep inspiration for this exhibition. We wanted to think about the stakes of Wyeth embedded in the natural world, observing its fragile rhythms, capturing it as it was in his lifetime as that process takes on new significance in these two places. So we'll say more about that a bit later. Can you add some more texture about the things we were learning from Lauren Stockwell? How did she understand Andrew Wyeth in relation to the species he depicted?
Well, she helped me understand a lot about the different communities of nature that are on the island. And this particular watercolor, we have an image of an uprooted spruce tree, dead and decaying on the forest floor, and yet it's surrounded by mosses and ferns and other species of nature that are almost a rebirth. It's almost a habitat for regrowth. And this is also in keeping with a lot of Andrew's other landscapes where death and rebirth are part of what he's expressing.
Absolutely. She was really interesting to see through the eyes of a botanist, those cycles in nature made explicit. They sort of wash over us if we're art lovers who are not steeped in natural science. And she helped us understand this concept of plant communities that was really interesting, that there's a kind of fundamental interdependency and interconnection in nature that she sees manifested in Wyeth's work, that he seems organically to understand how the fall of one tree enables the growth of another, and how all these undergrowth species depend on the canopy. So that was a really interesting observation when you bring in that outside expertise of somebody coming from a science background. So I love that. She also, however, helped us to understand the ways in which Wyeth is not scientific. So can you give us a little more texture there?
This watercolor titled Starflowers, you see this wonderful explosion of color in a meadow on Banner Island. And in actuality, the flowers are probably not starflowers. They're probably a species of chickweed. When Lauren looked at this watercolor, she exclaimed, because she loved it immediately, was excited by the composition. And then she said, oh, but wait, starflowers. Starflowers grow in the woods. So in this case, we have this sort of drama presented by Andrew Wyeth, and yet it's not, they're not starflowers. It always reminds me of a saying that I've read about, where Andrew talks about the color white, and he says, white is always this amazing thing to me. So I'm sure in this case, his thoughts were about the whiteness and the drama that we're seeing.
Yeah, not so much about identification of an individual plant species. That is not the purpose of his practice. Can we see that next image that I think shows what a real starflower looks like? So yeah, if we're interested for the plant identifiers out there, this is a correct starflower, and despite that evocative title of the watercolor you just saw, that does not seem to be a starflower. So I don't think that is a primary interest of Wyeth's work. He is not focused on identifying species correctly. He's looking at them imaginatively, as again that subtitle has it, and departing from them to serve his own artistic impulses and inspirations. So one elephant in the room. What were you going to say, Amy? Go ahead.
I was just going to say, this reminds me of a field trip I took out to Banner Island to really see if starflowers were growing on the island. And yes, they are. So he was in the ballpark. They were growing in the woods close by the meadow where he painted them.
There you go. That's a useful reminder that Amy, too, the lead curator on this project, was also doing field work to try to understand these sites he was painting, to understand where he departed from them. So we're very fortunate still to be able to go back to these places, that this is a relatively recent creative story, and we can piece together an understanding of the choices this artist was making in the place. So there's an elephant in the room here, which is, are these by definition all works of plein air, outdoor practice? Or are some of these studio works? What do we know about that?
Andrew, I would say all of the watercolors and drawings in the exhibition were completed outdoors and on site. Andrew used to say he loved to walk a great deal, looking at the countryside, exploring it with a very blank mind, hoping to hear something, hoping to see something. And he always felt that nature came in by the back door. So yes, Andrew was walking and exploring every day. He always had his supplies with him, his paint box, as he does here.
And it is that very paint box that you can see in the exhibition. I think we have an image of that case again to remind you. So yeah, that little old metal lump in the gallery has great stories to tell. That is the precise object you see in that photograph. Again, we're so fortunate that this story is so recent and so well documented, and that we can often piece together the materials, the tools of his practice. And I know there's a lot of interest in that aspect of his work, that Wyeth inspires a lot of people who make things. And we already have one question in the Q&A I saw on a technical process level. So we'll try to get to those at the end. We invite any questions you'd like to put in the Q&A at the bottom of our screen, and we'll be sure to allow time later. So I think from here we should get deeper into the topic of these fascinating letters that inspired us. We've already showed you a number of the artworks in the show. Mostly we're talking about watercolors. There are some fascinating ink and pencil works. But I'd love to dive deep into what we can learn from this one particular letter that Amy raised up to our attention, and we reflected on a great deal in the catalog. This, I'll just quickly note before turning to Amy, is a lovely microsite that exists in conjunction with the show. It is linked with a QR code on the labels when you visit the gallery in person. And perhaps one of my Farnsworth colleagues could put the link to that in the chat or Q&A at the bottom of the screen. I believe you'll find it's linked from the Every Leaf Twig exhibition page on the Farnsworth website. So from this format, you don't just have to take our word for it. You can click into each of these fascinating documents, look through them in high resolution. They've been transcribed, so you don't have to deal with old handwriting. And I think you'll see just how juicy and useful these things are. But tell me, Amy, what you learned from, in particular, the letter shown on the left here.
I'm good. There we go. The letter on the left was written to Andrew's in-laws, written after Andrew and Betsy had returned to Chad's Ford in the late fall. And he's writing to his in-laws back in Cushing, Maine. And he's talking about his current painting project. And he's describing the location as being a cornfield above the village of Chad's Ford. And he's talking about the great unbleached color of the fields. The fields hadn't been touched yet. And he's talking about walking down the rows of the corn stalks and feeling like a king who's walking down the row of all the knights that are standing at attention. And as I read that, I was thinking, my gosh, he was 4 probably at the time. The oil and canvas piece on the right side of King Edward was being painted, and he probably spent a lot of time in his father's studio watching the painting process and looking at all the costumes. And he himself had a great collection of soldiers and knights. So he's definitely memorizing, thinking back to what it was like when he was growing up. But I guess I was struck with the fact that he writes so eloquently, and he writes about nature in almost the same vein that he draws or paints. Mm-hmm. He goes on in the letter, and again, the visitors can see it on the microsite. He goes on to talk about the plants, and not only the plants, but the life under the plants. Talks about how he'd like to take some of the plants back to his studio to study what's growing in the soil under the plants. So fascinated by the depth with which he describes and writes about corn, not just how he illustrates with them.
Absolutely. And I think I just saw Gwendolyn share the link to that website. So if you're interested in clicking through the 2 letters in the show in greater detail later, you can now do so. This is it. This is the ultimate kind of smoking gun. What a fascinating glimpse into a creative mind at work, that he's walking through a dead, desiccated cornfield, and he's envisioning knights on horseback and thinking through that imaginative world conjured by his dad NC, the one who owned that copy of the Thoreau book. We're bringing it full circle here. So I love this letter, and I think that is so rich. You see that imagination. We're really making that point clearly that he's not merely replicating the outward appearances of things. He's finding in these humble subjects all this possibility, great dramas and deeds and romance in ordinary dead corn. We also really like this letter as something that connects our worlds, as something that goes between Pennsylvania and Maine and shows just how interconnected we are, that we have to be thinking across that geographic divide. So I hope you'll enjoy going through that letter in greater detail too. It really does feel like a cue to think differently about these subjects as a whole. All of those beautiful watercolors in the gallery, they risk just washing over us, and that we stop at this level of just thinking, wow, Andrew Wyeth really liked plants. They're very pretty, they're easy to love. But through a letter like this one, we understand just how deep all of his work goes, that there are always these layers of life and death and everything, that he is coming out of this really unique creative upbringing with NC Wyeth, and is seeing in these humble subjects all of that. So as you go through the galleries at the Farnsworth, I hope you'll bear that context in mind. Think about what he might be seeing in a sheet like the one on the right there. Now, tell me what else, was there anything else that surprised you as you were going through the drawers in the Wyeth Study Center and thinking about what might make the cut for inclusion in the show?
Gone by is an interesting watercolor. The composition has no horizon line, so you're actually looking, you feel like you're looking on a flat surface almost, with the wonderful structure and lines of the petals and the flower, and the light shining from above or shining through the understory of the trees. And the other interesting thing about this watercolor is I found a lot of inclusions in the upper right portion of the piece, where there were pieces of moss and grass that I'm sure Andrew embraced having that in the watercolor paint, and it was a surprise for me.
I love that. I've heard similar stories about Vincent van Gogh's work, that you often find little bits of seeds and things in his wildly painted outdoor oil practice. So you get a sense of the physicality, the outdoor work, that he's with his subject matter as he's capturing it, even as he is making these strange, inky, dark works that don't have any depth at all, no space to recede into, just kind of pure surface and pattern. So a really shocking thing for folks who might know better, things like Christina's World, where you have a lovely space to recede into, that beloved Olsen house and Christina Olsen in the foreground. This is quite the opposite, just this flat, austere, strange thing. Show us some more good things from the show, Amy.
This is an interesting pairing. The pen and ink of the apple trees on the left has a very interesting feel. The skeletal dormant apple tree seems to be dancing across the page to me. And then on the right, Orchard at Eight Bells, the apples and the tree seems much more lush. And I feel like I can almost smell or taste the apple that's hanging from the small branch. That one, interesting 40 years difference between the two pieces, but very, very different, but very interesting.
Those are really beautiful works there, and we should underline that they are landscapes that he knew very well. These are places that they inhabited. Broad Cove has a particular meaning in Wyeth World. Eight Bells has a particular meaning in Wyeth World. These are owned, deeply known landscapes that were very important to the Wyeths. So that is a unique kind of insight that comes of living with a subject matter, getting to know it as a kind of a slow process of looking, meditative, extended practice. And that is a frequent phenomenon we see in Wyeth World across these two states. How about another?
Poetry study, which was done in 2007 when Andrew was 90. And interesting dead spruce tree that's still standing, very isolated. And yet in the background, you see a very young, green, vibrant looking forest that's sort of upgrowing and just starting. I wonder if Andrew felt his own imminent demise at this point. There have been suggestions that this might be a self-portrait, but it's an interesting watercolor and it's an interesting thought at this time in his career.
That was very well said. I got a call from our friend Victoria Wyeth the other day, calling me to account for perhaps making the very point you've just made a little bit too strongly, that there is a fascinating suggestion to be made. And our friend Chris Crossman has made this point in the past in the catalog of the project Andrew Wyeth in retrospect, that there is a certain juxtaposition of the extreme lateness of this work in Andrew Wyeth's career, the starkness and skeletal nature of this tree, and the potential for reflection on Wyeth's own mortality. So that is a suggestion we would like to pose to you. We do not mean to suggest that is the only way to read this object. So we're always reading these things creatively and finding new layers in them. And that is a layer that has been raised about this object. So now we're coming to the end of our time here, and I alluded to this a bit previously. How are these ecosystems of Wyeth's world, both Mid-Coast Maine, that's the focus of the Farnsworth installation, and the Brandywine Valley, that's the focus of the Brandywine installation, how are these places changing since Wyeth's lifetime? Oops, are we frozen?
No.
All right, there we are. Did you get that question there, Amy? I was asking, how have these landscapes changed? Yeah.
Well, Lauren Stockwell's helped me to understand that with the warming of the Gulf of Maine, and as you can see from the graph, it's warming at an alarming rate. Gradually the coastal forest, the forest that's right along the immediate coast, softwoods, will be replaced by hardwood trees. So there could be a complete change in the tree structure and the tree growth, the types of trees that are along the coast if the warming continues at the rate that it is.
Yeah, it's been really fascinating speaking with colleagues at the Gulf of Maine Research Institute who kindly allowed us to use this unmistakably clear chart that shows what we're seeing in the Gulf of Maine warming more rapidly than 99% of global ocean waters. Really dramatic things happening, and we need to be aware of that. And I think we see a model of that attunement and awareness in Wyeth's work. From the Pennsylvania perspective, we can share that we are seeing some dramatic changes too. Hurricane Ida 2021, dramatic flooding in our region that impacted Wyeth's world. So things are changing before our very eyes, and it's sort of incumbent upon all of us to be aware of that and attuned to that. And we're so fortunate to have this creative legacy before these topics were on the tip of everyone's tongue. We see a life lived in the natural world, a quiet meditative practice, focusing on those plant specimens that are impacted by the changes that you see in a document like this one. Can we have the next slide, please? I think we have another good image to share here. Can you tell us about this object, Amy?
Is a wonderful, almost it seems alive to me, watercolor of a pine tree, which was done in Appleton, which is really an outlier in terms of the exhibition. Most of the works in the exhibition were done right along the coast in Cushing and on the islands, but this is definitely far from home. But this is the kind of tree that will be replaced with a hardwood tree if the conditions of climate change, the warming of the Gulf of Maine continues.
Mm-hmm. So we're nearly at our end here, and I'd love to invite you to reflect, Amy, on what you hope a visitor will take away from a visit to Every Leaf and Twig. Of course, we also hope that we can share the insights of this exhibition with folks far and wide, those who can't make it to Rockland or Part 2 in Chadsford. Please do check out that catalog, and we'll hope to do more programs as this goes. But for those in-person visitors, what do you think that they will take away from this project?
Well, I think one of the main things is the vast width, the breadth of Andrew's work and the subject matter. I think the exhibition with plants and trees has really widened all of our ideas in terms of what he does and how he paints and what he paints. I also think his great understanding of nature and the cycle of nature, and the great understanding of nature in his own world is something. This attunement is something we all should celebrate and embrace ourselves.
Absolutely. What kind of visitor interactions or methods have you noticed as you sort of peek into the show and see how people are responding to your brainchild?
Well, I love the groups of children. We've had a great response in the school community to come and visit and sketch and talk about the exhibition and what they're seeing. But some of the other visitors, when I've peeked in, seem very quiet. Even in groups of 3 or 4 people, I don't see any conversation happening or hearing conversation. It seems that people are just sort of quietly looking at what they're seeing and sort of contemplating it and enjoying it.
Absolutely. Well, that's the end of our scheduled remarks here. I see that we have a couple of questions now, so maybe we can turn to those. We might even unshare the screen and then we can see each other bigger so everybody attending can see more clearly who we've been talking to. We have a question from Evan McGlynn, I believe it was. Can you tell us about how long, in terms of time, Wyeth would take to paint a single watercolor? And if it's possible to contrast one of these rather freely painted watercolors in the show with that famous sub-process of Wyeth World dry brush, that would be welcome. Do you have a sense of the time scale of these watercolors?
Gee, that is a difficult question, because I think each piece depends on the subject matter and the medium that Andrew was using. But I would say perhaps a couple watercolors a day. Dry brush is certainly a much more detailed technique. It would take longer, much more thinking on his part. But I would say probably a day for a couple of watercolors. And again, if he was doing studies, doing some pencil studies, he might do a couple of those along with the watercolors.
In contrast to that, what can you tell our attendees about the relative timescale of his most famous medium, tempera, and what might be an average time to make one work in egg tempera?
I'd say I would say at least I'm thinking of a summer, because summer was the time Andrew and Betsy spent in Maine. I would say 2 or 3 months for a tempera. And again, it depends on the subject matter. It depends on how the piece came together. I've seen him work on a tempera for a while and then sort of put it or keep it in the studio and go out and do some more sketches or drawings on site to get just the feel or the details that he's looking for.
I hope you all caught that note. This is a reminder that in addition to being one of the leading scholars of Andrew Wyeth's work, Amy Morey is herself a primary source, and she's able to start sentences like, "I have seen Andrew paint blank." So I'm always learning from her. It's a real privilege to mix that bird's eye view knowledge of the collection with the firsthand personal knowledge of working so closely with Betsy for many years. There's one question I can answer quickly from, let's see what that name was. Chuck Shoemaker asked, will it be the same show at the Brandywine? Let me clarify, this is an interesting model we're trying out for our startup period, this new era of partnership around the Wyeth legacy. This is, as we're thinking of it, an exhibition in 2 parts, where the ideas move, the way of looking, the aspect of Wyeth's work that intrigues us is consistent across the 2 installations, but the checklists are almost completely different. We'll have the same letters that are the core inspiration for the show in the 2 places, the Thoreau volume as well, but the watercolors will be a whole new Pennsylvania set. The catalog that Gwendolyn showed earlier is the way that this comes together. The book that you can now get in the Farnsworth store includes both the Maine checklist and the Pennsylvania checklist. Our colleague Karen Baumgartner asks a useful question. Karen works in the other Wyeth Study Center location in Pennsylvania. We were talking about this problem of starflowers, and she asked whether it is possible, because that species does exist on Allen Island, it is possible instead that Wyeth kind of transported them imaginatively from a forest interior out to an open meadow? Or is it simply the case that those flowers out there in the open meadow cannot be the same flowers? What do you say to that?
Well, a great question. And thank you, Karen. I tested it. I went out on another field trip and looked at the site on Banner Island where Star Flowers was painted, and there were flowers growing in the site. And one of our coworkers on the island helped me identify which flowers we were talking about for the watercolor, and bringing the specimen in, and Lauren looking at it, it was definitely from the chickweed family. It was definitely not a star flower. So I have a feeling that just the whole excitement of seeing that mass of white, that sort of chaos of white, was something that caught his attention and his emotions at the time. And that, yes, that was what he painted. That.
Fair enough. So that is all the questions I see here. Gwendolyn or Abby, any other questions from you? Or if anybody else wants to get a last minute question in, feel free.
Thank you so much, Will and Amy. This has been really fascinating. And I have to say, one of the first things I noted in the exhibition, but really appreciate your mentioning, is the fact that obviously so many times we take Andrew Wyeth and his work and sort of separate it out from the whole canon of everything sort of surrounding him. But obviously he was working in not only a very much contemporary context, but also looking at, other people's work as well as he was creating. And I have to say, I particularly I keep coming back to sort of this Victorian sort of bell jar effect that he has of being able to really kind of put a cloche over the specimens he's looking at. And it's not really to, again, interpret them in any sort of scientific way, but to kind of give them this whole enchanting spirit. And as Amy said, I can say that, we've had so many experiences here in the galleries where we have just walked through and seen, adults and school groups and every age in between, and they're just really fascinated by these works. And it's a very quiet, introspective exhibition. And not that we always have, obstreperous visitors, but at the same time, this is going to have been a particularly quiet and introspective one. And it's brought a lot of joy to a lot of visitors. So certainly want to thank you for that today. And Abby, do you have any? Abigail Nash is helping us run the tech in the background, but she is by no means in the background. We couldn't do it without her. She's our public programs coordinator. Abby, do you have any questions or any thoughts for us? Not to put you totally on the spot, but happy to have you pipe in, or we'll certainly ask anybody else to put anything else in the Q&A box.
Oh, it's so lovely to be here beside Amy and hear all of this firsthand knowledge and accounts and watch the progression. I think one question that came to mind is, as you put this show together, how did you, I know you talked about how at the end of his time, some of the paintings seemed like they might have been thinking about the end of his life, or how he was thinking about his life in general. But if you compare that to some of his earlier works, what kind of takeaways do you take as his works progress throughout his life?
I think that's an interesting question. Makes me think for a minute. I think even though the fields of Broad Cove, the apple tree that's very skeletal, that's dormant, it speaks of death and yet rebirth at the same time. So I'm thinking of a couple other watercolors in the show that weren't part of the PowerPoint that show trees that are still standing, but obviously dead and decaying, and you see fungus growing on them. So I think at many stages in his career, he's dealt with objects, plants, trees that represent death or the life cycle, part of the life cycle. So that's an interesting question, but I think I see that vein sort of going through the whole exhibition.
I'd like to reflect on that interesting question a little bit, to zoom out from it a little bit. And I think that what that makes me reflect on, just kind of seat of the pants, unprocessed thoughts, is that we are noticing there is a fundamental kind of consistency in Wyeth's work. Yes, there are some things that are fundamentally different early and late. There's this whole early body of oil on canvas, the juvenilia of Andrew Wyeth, a medium he tries when he's young and pretty much sets aside. There are these early watercolors where he's using really rich, lush colors, and that kind of gets set aside. We get into this mature, very minimal palette. But choice of subject matter is pretty darn consistent. And there's this through line through his whole life in both of our current projects, the one in Pennsylvania included, where he is taking up surprising, stark, abstract gestural work when it suits him from the very beginning of his life right to the end. And we're seeing these fascinating botanical works from very early in his life right to the end. So I don't know quite what to do with that. That's a really interesting kind of focus throughout his life. It's not that he wasn't experimenting, not that he wasn't finding wholly unexpected new creative chapters along the way, but there is a sense in which he found his voice, found his inspiration early, and just stuck with it and kept on finding new layers and possibilities within the general working methods he adopted early on.
Thank you. Yeah.
Great. Well, thank you very much. I have to say, this has been fun. I feel like we're all sort of sitting in a living room together, even though we're all in different spaces and states right now, too. So thank you both to Amy and Dr. Will Coleman. And I wanted to just mention again, the catalog has, hope you can see this. Wow, never done this before, ever. Every Leaf Twig, which is at the museum store. It's a lovely, lovely book and just wonderful, very thought-provoking essays written by Will and Amy and Lauren Stockwell as well. So certainly thank you. At the Farnsworth, we are winding up the year. This is our last virtual talk of the year. So we really want to thank you for joining us and thank you for supporting us at the Farnsworth. I hear a membership makes a great gift for the holiday season, just saying. But certainly come and visit us in the galleries and stay tuned for more public programs and exhibitions. We're just starting to unveil our 2024 season soon. So lots of things. And I have to say, lots of studio programs also inspired by this exhibition. And we'll also bring you another exhibition related program specifically for Every Leaf Twig coming up very shortly. So stay tuned for that. Thank you, everyone, for joining us and have a wonderful afternoon.